I'm Angela.
And I'm Paige.
In the 7 years that Paige and I have been friends, we have shared true crime stories that we are obsessed with. This podcast is a hobby discussing the intricate details of true crime cases. Welcome to the Corruptpod.
We assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this episode. The Corrupt Podcast is based on the facts and our opinions of the case. Listener discretion is advised. This is the second part covering the murder of Betty Gore in 1980 Texas. If you haven't already, please go listen to episode 1. This episode does include discussion on suicide and graphic details of Betty's murder. We left part 1 with the neighbors finding Betty Gore's body in the utility room on the evening of June 13th, 1980. Betty's body was examined by Dr. Vincent DeMayo, the Dallas County Medical Examiner. DeMayo is 39 years old and had performed 3,500 autopsies by 1980. The only other murder involving an axe that Dr. DeMayo had seen was a strangulation, and then the axe was used for dismemberment. Dr. DeMayo found 5 cuts on Betty's right arm. These cuts appeared to be defense wounds. On Betty's left arm were 5 more cuts. These were horizontal, as if the axe had been swung left to right. There were additional wounds on Betty's hands, shoulders, and left leg. Betty had 3 wounds on her thighs and may have occurred after Betty was on the utility room floor. The majority of Betty's wounds were to her head and right half of her face. In total, there were over 20 strikes to her head. She had suffered 6 vertical axe strikes to the right side of her face. On the left side of her face, Betty had 3 horizontal strikes while she was still standing. There were a couple glancing blows during the struggle for the axe, and Dr. DeMayo knew they were during the struggle due to the curved appearance. On top of Betty's head, running almost ear to ear, were at least 7 more blows. Finally, there were 3 more deep strikes on the back of Betty's head. 2 of the 3 strikes on the back of Betty's head showed evidence that the axe had been stuck and was moved back and forth to dislodge the axe from bone. And if you guys could just see Angela's face as I was reading out.
I have a strong stomach, but I get squeamish. I'm just ugh. It goes through all my body. I don't know what that accent was.
Also, the axe being stuck in the bone and wiggling it back and forth.
Yeah, that part. It just went through my body again. Thanks.
You're welcome. I find so much enjoyment out of the technicalities of this. You're so squeamish about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, it was stuck. Candy had to wiggle it back and forth.
Ooh.
Yeah, to get it out 3 times. The force that it would have taken her. And Candy is smaller than Betty as well.
Right. Candy and Pat spent the morning doing yard work on Saturday, June 14th, 1980. The neighbors and people from church called Candy on the phone. Pat walked in on Candy applying peroxide to her toe. She told him it was injured by the metal storm door they had been meaning to fix.
There was a phone tree going on with all the women at church, calling each other, like, did you hear about Betty? Did you hear about Betty? So Candy's in and out of the house all day. The phone's ringing off the hook. Before bed, Pat sees bruises on Candy's thighs, and he appears to believe her explanation about doing housework and easily bruising. She says that she's bumping into the dishwasher.
Man, those 1980 dishwashers.
Did she climb in? I think he's kind of naive here as well.
She also took garden shears and destroyed her pair of flip-flops that she had worn during the murder. Allan arrived home to speak with detectives that were at his house. The detectives had previously allowed Allan to think Betty had died of a gunshot, but now they let him know her true cause of death.
And they did this so they could confirm his story and know that he had an alibi. So he came to them saying, oh, she died of a gunshot wound, and they said, she sure did, and let him decide if he was going to dig himself into a hole here or if he has a legitimate alibi.
There was an interview, I think, of one of the cops or one of the detectives. I don't know if you saw it or not, but he was saying before he even got there, everybody was in the house.
Yes.
Like the neighbors, the dogs, whoever. They were just rummaging through the house. Yep. And he's like, most of the evidence, if there was any, probably was destroyed.
Yeah, physical evidence was definitely compromised in this case right out the gate.
Yeah. Candy and Pat left Jenny and Ian with a neighbor and took Elisa home at 4 p.m. They stayed while Allan told Elisa that Betty was dead.
This is so horrifying to me because Elisa is there finding out that her mom is dead. She's mourning for her mother. And Candy can't stand the sight of her crying, so she goes over and hugs Elisa and Allan, knowing that she did this.
That's dark.
It really is. And in the show, Elisa finds out that Betty's dead, and she asks who's going to take care of them and who's going to make them dinner. She's a baby, she's so young. And they show Allan struggling with just the basic things, like he doesn't know how to run the dishwasher. He doesn't know how to change a diaper because Betty handled all that stuff. She was working full time and still taking care of the entire house. He has no idea how to do that stuff.
Candy was interviewed by police on Father's Day 1980. Candy tells police that she went to Betty's to pick up Elisa's swimsuit. Betty was sewing when she arrived at 10 a.m. Betty and Candy went outside to play with the dogs. Candy used the Gore's restroom to pick her permed hair. Then Candy went into the utility room to grab Elisa's swimsuit and towel. Betty also gave Candy some peppermints as a reward to Elisa for putting her head underwater during lessons. Candy estimated the entire visit took 15 minutes. Candy lies and says she was wearing blue sneakers instead of flip-flops.
And she's later relieved that the police didn't ask why her fingernail on her pinky finger was cut to the quick. And this was because the investigators had found the nail at the Gore's house. And also, this whole interview here is Candy's first story. This is not the final story.
Betty's parents and brothers arrive in Wiley. Betty's brother Richard answered a phone call at the Gore's house. A man called the house and said, "I killed her," then hung up. The man called several times, and Betty's other brother, Ronnie, was able to keep him on the phone long enough for the police to trace the call. The caller was a man living at a halfway house that had been recently released from a mental hospital. Allan answered a call on Monday, and the man said, "Elisa's next," and hung up.
Yeesh.
Elisa and Bethany's names had been in the newspaper. How awful is that? To just have your wife just murdered and then receive those kind of phone calls?
Absolutely.
I'd be staying at a hotel.
Yeah.
Would not be at my house.
I'm really surprised they didn't make them stay at a hotel.
I'm sure they would nowadays.
Because now it would be a crime scene. You wouldn't be allowed in the house. Candy volunteered to take food made by the ladies at church to Allan. She had to go into the utility room to put food in the freezer.
Uh-oh.
How freaking eerie would that be?
Yeah, was it hard for her or was it not hard for her?
I would think it's very hard.
Yeah.
Even if this was not self-defense and this was murder, I think it would still be very eerie and very hard for her going into that utility room and putting food in the freezer that was right where Betty's body laid. Allan was interviewed by police on Monday, June 16th. He was considered the prime suspect until witnesses cleared him as being in Minnesota. The police asked him about any affairs, and Allan told them about Betty's 1971 affair with another college student. When they asked if he had ever had an affair, Allan said no.
Come on, Allan, don't be a bitch.
Oh my gosh.
I'm going to keep bringing that back.
Yeah. He does eventually have a guilty conscience, but right now he's telling them, nope, no affairs here, officers. Later that night, Allan finally thought to ask Elisa what she remembered from June 13th. Elisa said that Candy dropped her off for VBS, then returned around lunch. Allan called the police at 6 a.m. on June 17th to let them know he had lied during his prior interview, that he had had an affair with Candy Montgomery. I think Allan knew something was wrong.
For sure.
It would have been too big of a gap of time. Candy's like, oh yeah, I was only there 15 minutes. Well, she was only going to go get cards in the next town over. That was way too big of a gap of time that she's missing there. Candy was interviewed a second time by the police. When asked outright about an affair, Candy did confirm her affair with Allan. The police put the pressure on her, but she denied killing Betty. Pat immediately called Don Crowder, a local personal injury attorney and church member. Don advised Candy that she would not be taking the police polygraph test, but he would hire his own polygraph technician. Reporters started to follow Candy after the police leaked information on their suspect. The Montgomerys went to stay with friends in the country for the weekend to avoid the press. Don told Candy to meet him at his house for a private meeting, and Candy drove over to Don's by herself. She admitted to killing Betty in self-defense. Candy and Don decided not to tell Pat, since he might turn her into the police himself. In the book, they said that they didn't tell Pat because he has a good conscience. I really think it might be because of his feelings of the affair, that he would have been mad. Now this is a whole nother level. First, it was an affair. I've forgiven you for that. Now you've murdered the wife.
Yeah.
I think he probably had more anger than the book implied.
Candy had a physical examination done on June 20th, 1980. They found half-dollar-sized bruises on her thighs and chest and additional bruises on her ankles, fingers, and one breast. She had a cut at her hairline and on her left middle toe. Allan was interviewed by the police again, this time because they thought he was an accomplice with Candy. He hired an attorney, then told Betty's family about the affair. Allan left Elisa with Betty's parents in Kansas.
But it would appear he kept Bethany with him. They don't really mention Bethany. And if he does know how to change a diaper, really he should have just left her in Kansas as well.
Agreed. Then on June 24th, 1980, Betty's father, Bob, decided it was time to get back to farming. Word got around the community. At least a dozen neighboring farmers showed up, unloaded their equipment, and helped get work done.
What a nice community the Pomerys had around them. This was 11 days after his daughter's murder. He's been going back and forth to Texas. They're taking Elisa in, and they showed up and really helped him.
The murder investigation appeared to be completed after Allan passed his polygraph test. The police had a bloody fingerprint that they matched to Candy, and they felt they had talked to everyone with possible motives. The warrant for Candy's arrest was issued. Even at 11 p.m., the police delivered the warrant to Candy in front of the press. Her bail was set at $100,000. They put down $10,000 and the deed to the home to keep Candy out of jail. Candy spent the first night in jail as the police wouldn't accept the out-of-county bond. Candy's first court appearance and arraignment hearing was the following morning. She was officially indicted for murder. Candy pleaded not guilty based on the advice of her attorney. After the bond had been posted and Candy was released from jail, Dawn Crowder decided it was time for her to change her appearance and show more emotion. She was told to grow her hair out and straighten it. She was also told to lose some weight so she could look smaller than Betty. She was no longer allowed to smoke in public as it made her look tough.
In photos of Candy you see at this time, she had received a bad perm from her friend Sherry. So her hair has this really tight curl to it. It's permed, but it's a really tight curl. So I think it was smart of Dawn to make her look like a typical housewife. She's too small to hurt anyone.
Yeah, the perm was not attractive.
It was not good look for her.
What was Allan thinking? What was Pat thinking?
I don't know. What was Candy thinking? It was just the times. It was permed hair, but it was her hair was very short too. Dawn also met with Ron, the Lucas Methodist pastor, about Candy's arrest. Most of the congregation believed the police were villains and that Candy couldn't be responsible. Dawn requested that Ron announce that Candy was a suspect to the congregation. She's trying to kind of distance her from this. Oh, she really couldn't do this. You know, she's innocent here. I think that was a smart move for him. Mm-hmm. And then Candy just didn't show up for church, and it gave her a little bit of that distance. Even Pat thought that Candy was being wrongfully convicted. But when he asked her outright about it, Candy told him that Dawn had told her not to talk about it. And Pat didn't like Candy's answer, so he went searching for her flip-flops. Pat couldn't find Candy's flip-flops and became more suspicious when Candy told him that she had thrown them away a while ago.
And Candy was known to almost always have flip-flops on.
Absolutely. So now she's wearing around these little blue sneakers, like these slip-on sneakers. Just very out of character for her.
Do we think Pat was maybe too complacent?
I don't think so. I think he's onto her at this point. He saw her toe. I'm sure he saw her forehead. He saw the bruises on her legs. He knows this was no dishwasher. So I think he's putting the pieces together. Otherwise, he wouldn't have asked about the flip-flops.
And even the ladies at church noticed that Candy wasn't wearing flip-flops when she returned to the VBS.
Exactly. There were no witnesses and minimal physical evidence against Candy. Most of the evidence was circumstantial. Candy had been interviewed twice before she had a lawyer, and her body had not been photographed for 2 weeks. No blood or hair samples were even taken. Her station wagon had been searched, but weeks after the murder, Candy also had no prior arrests and a good reputation.
When they finally did obtain a search warrant for her car, they found a tiny amount of blood on the brake pedal.
Yep.
Gotcha.
That and the bathroom mat. They find a little bit of blood on the bathroom mat.
Dawn Crowder's office continued to play with the police. He took to the newspapers, calling the police mad dogs.
The police had demanded clothes that Candy was wearing from June 13th, 1980. But Dawn played a game that he was calling musical chairs with the clothes. Dawn and 2 other people on Candy's defense team put the clothes in a bag. They sealed it and had it signed by a witness. Then when the police called asking about the clothes, Dawn told them they were right where they should be. Meanwhile, Dawn, Elaine, and Rob were moving them between their homes and the office. Apparently this was legal. He's in some kind of a loophole here, but it really feels like he's tampering with evidence.
It's a little absurd. They kept the police from having probable cause that the clothes were in any particular place and obtaining a search warrant. Eventually, Dawn gave the bag to Pat and told him to place it in the closet. The clothes remained in the closet until the day of Candy's trial.
So it worked.
Yep. On July 9th, 1980 at 4:18 p.m., the grand jury indicted Candy for murder. The media had gotten too involved in the case, so Candy's attorney filed for a gag order. During the meeting, Candy was rearrested and spent a week in jail. In August, Dawn and Candy flew to Houston to meet Dr. Fred Faison. Fred did a series of tests over a couple of weeks. Candy spent 2 hours under hypnosis with Dr. Faison. While under hypnosis, Candy said that she wouldn't let Betty hit her again, that she didn't want Allan and she hated Betty for messing up her whole life. When asked if Candy ever remembered being that mad before, Candy said she did when she was 4 years old. Candy recited a story about losing a race to a friend. She got so mad that she threw a glass jar against a pump. Candy ended up with a cut between her eyes and a trip to the ER. The only thing Candy remembers her mother saying was, "Shh, what will people think in the waiting room?" She told the doctor that she wanted to kick and scream just hearing the shh. They determined Candy's rage came from her 4-year-old self and her mother shushing her screams at the hospital. The sessions were recorded. The murder trial began in October 1980. Judge Tom Ryan was nearing retirement from the Collin County Courthouse. This would be his last big trial before retirement.
He was apparently very cranky about taking on a case this size and not being retired. But there was something about either he's a Republican or he's a Democrat, and he can't let the other side get in, so he doesn't retire that year, and he ends up getting stuck with this huge case. And he is not at all impressed.
There was a media frenzy for spots in the courtroom. People lined up before dawn and waited all day for a seat. Judge Ryan had to ban food from the courtroom to keep people from packing lunches and staying all day.
So if you move, you lose your spot. So that meant that some of the people didn't eat or used the bathroom all day long, just so they could see the trial. Of the selected jurors, 9 of the 12 were women. It wasn't until the jury selection that Dawn told the court that Candy had committed adultery and had killed Betty in self-defense.
The prosecution was not impressed, and they didn't know how Dawn would defend Candy. It was hard to kind of disprove the self-defense.
Absolutely. It started them off on the wrong foot because now they have to rethink their whole prosecution set up there.
Yeah.
Their story. On the second day of the trial, Dawn Crowder was found to be in contempt of court for talking to the press. Dawn stated that Judge Ryan had included the media in his office the prior week, but Judge Ryan still fined Dawn $100 and 24 hours jail time, which he served on the next weekend. And Dawn is known for being a hothead, so he was not gonna take any crap from the judge. They went into this courtroom already not liking each other. Allan was the first witness to take the stand. He spoke in a monotone voice, even when showed the axe with Betty's dried blood still on it.
We actually know that Candy was prescribed Serax, which is similar to Xanax on several occasions. So we would imagine, that Allan was probably also prescribed something to get him through this trial.
I would imagine. This is very hard on them. Their whole life is on display. He's on the stand looking at his wife's family sitting there. So I'm sure this was so hard. On the stand, Allan also said that to his knowledge, Candy had never been in the garage to see the axe, and confirmed their affair did end in October 1979, so 1 year prior to the trial. Dr. Irvine Stone took the stand to discuss the physical evidence. He described the blood-covered doorknobs, the bloody footprint made by flip-flops, and the bloody thumbprint on the freezer. He discussed the shower mat having Candy's blood after her shower, and the drain containing 2 of potentially Candy's hairs. 6 people had passed the fingernail around during the search of the home, and it was confirmed to be Candy's. 6 people touched that fingernail.
They passed it around?
Oh, look, we found a pinky nail.
With their bare hands?
6 people. Yeah. That's not preserving the integrity of the evidence. That's not great, guys. In 1980, the chemical to lift fingerprints from surfaces was very expensive. So they're looking at the fingerprint on the freezer, and instead of using that chemical, they opted to take a photo. But they're also running out of film. So the prosecution had 1 photo of the bloody fingerprint. Just 1. It's a good thing it wasn't blurry. There's 1 photo out there. I also don't like that it's potentially 2 of Candy's hairs. That isn't good enough. That's reasonable doubt right there.
Mm-hmm. It just reminds me of that one part in the Hulu series, Candy, where the one officer came and brought the broken sunglass.
Mm-hmm. He just picks it up right out of the garage.
Yeah, the lens. And he hands it to Justin Timberlake. And Justin was like, damn it, Fred.
Go put that back.
Go put it back.
Show me where you found it. I think they did a very accurate description.
Yes,
of
they
that.
did. Forensics expert Vincent DeMeo testified in the trial. He confirmed that Candy struck Betty 41 times, 40 of which occurred while her heart was still beating.
What we don't know is if Betty was conscious. I would assume not with that many strikes to her head, though.
He also confirmed for the jury that there was no way to know if Candy had acted in self-defense. Not realizing that she would be the next witness called, Candy had taken a tranquilizer to calm herself after the autopsy findings. On the afternoon of October 23, 1980, Candy took the stand. Dawn questioned her on her family, history, and the Gores. Candy was frozen and clipped on the stand until Dawn made Candy look at the murder weapon. She screamed, cried, and admitted to killing Betty with the axe.
Pat would later say that he could hear the scream from several rooms away. He was not allowed to be in the courtroom.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Him or Allan.
Right. So they could hear her screaming, and I'm sure that was just heart-wrenching for him. We now have Candy's official story, and we're going to follow this up with Angela and my theory as well. On the stand, Candy said that she was due at the Gore house at noon on June 13th, 1980. She arrived early around 10 a.m. after dropping the kids off at VBS. Betty was wearing red denim shorts and a yellow shirt. Candy implied that Betty was formal and cold upon answering the door, and then warmed up to Candy. Betty had just laid Bethany down for a nap when Candy arrived. The two discussed Cheeto, the Cocker Spaniel puppy the Gores had recently adopted, and the business Candy and Sherry were starting. Candy said when she got up from the chair to let Betty know she needed to grab Elisa's bathing suit and leave, Betty had a strange look on her face. Betty then looked Candy right in the face and said, "Candy, are you having an affair with Allan?" When Candy denied the affair, Betty said, "But you did, didn't you?" Candy agreed that yes, she had had an affair with Allan, but it was a long time ago. It's like less than a year ago. Just a side note there. Betty rose abruptly and walked away. After a few seconds, Betty came back, but this time with a 3-foot axe in her hand. Yeah. Betty told Candy she never wanted Allan to see her again, and that you can't have him. Candy tried to reassure Betty by saying it had been over for a long time, she didn't want Allan, and Betty put the axe down and went to grab a towel for Elisa. She asked Candy to grab the swimsuit off the washer in the utility room. They met in the utility room door for Betty to hand over the towel and the peppermints. Candy put the towel, suit, and peppermints in her purse, then grabbed out her sunglasses. Betty's face no longer looked mad, but just very sad, and Candy told her that she was sorry. Per Candy, this appeared to be what set Betty off into a rage. Betty shoved Candy into the utility room and grabbed the axe from the doorway. They struggled over the axe, while Betty shouted that Candy couldn't have Allan. She was pregnant, and Candy couldn't have him this time. Betty told Candy that she had to kill her, then wrenched the axe upward with the flat side striking Candy's head. The next swing came down with the axe striking the linoleum floor and sliced Candy's toe. Candy shoved the axe against Betty, and when Betty fell backward, she struck Betty in the back of the head. Betty picked up the axe again and began to struggle. At one point, Candy gets the garage door open, but Betty forces it shut. Candy begs Betty to let her go, and Betty says, "Shh." According to Candy, this was the final straw, and she struck Betty over and over with the axe. Meanwhile, Bethany is crying, and the dogs outside are barking. After the murder, Candy stepped into the bathtub and washed her arms off. She took the towels to the utility room to try and clean up the blood, but there was too much to clean up. When she stands up, she uses the freezer as support, leaving the bloody fingerprint behind. Candy leaves the house, but realizes her watch stopped working when she got it wet in the shower. We know the rest of the story from here, but I do want to pause and talk about the defense's disassociative reaction to the shh moment. Dr. Green advised that Candy was mentally sound, but went momentarily berserk when she heard Betty's shh.
Berserk, huh?
Yeah, and they do have her checked to make sure that she's mentally sound. They take a whole day out of court to make sure that she is sound. And it came back really quickly that she's mentally sound. She just went berserk.
Okay. I guess we all have the chance to go
Oh,
berserk.
absolutely. Yeah, she snapped. So now we're on to Angela's theory.
I find it interesting that Candy would use the fact that her watch stopped in her cover-up story. It stopped working because of taking the shower at Betty's house to wash off the blood from her arms. And then she used it within her cover story about how she noticed her watch stop before running into Target. Technically, she didn't say why the watch stopped, but that was part of her cover still. So I found that interesting. Ultimately, in my vision, I feel like everything lines up. I think Betty was angry about the affair and had intentions to hurt Candy when Candy admitted her affair. At this point, we already know Betty was, a little self-conscious. She was stern with her students. She had a tendency of getting depressed quite easily. just, sprinkle a little candy in there, have sex with her husband, yeah, she's gonna snap. So should Candy have swung 41 blows mostly to Betty's head and murdered her? Absolutely not. But I do think there was some form of self-defense. You or I wouldn't know what we would have done in that situation necessarily, because, when that happens, you're scared, your adrenaline is off the charts, and you're trying to survive. But I would like to think knocking Betty out and running would have been my tactic. And it seems like Candy sort of tried to do that, but Betty just kept fighting. What if that one blow would have knocked Betty out? Maybe Candy would have left. Maybe she wouldn't have. The fact that Candy was asking Allan where he was to truly made me think that maybe there was a little part of her worried for the baby, since she also offered to go to their house a couple times too.
So my theory, we know that Betty, like you said, she had a lot on her plate. She's also, cherry on top there, worried that she's pregnant again. She had been to the doctor to get medication to start her period. They had checked. They're, saying, hey, you're not pregnant. She's still really stressed, thinking that she is. She's depressed. She's working. Allan's traveling for work. She's got a baby she's taking care of. Somehow she connects the dots of Allan and Candy. We will never know how. I find it interesting that Betty said, you can't have him this time, which makes me think she connected those dots to last time during her pregnancy with Bethany. I feel like there is some truth to Candy's story. It clearly wasn't premeditated, but I think Betty was giving Candy the cold shoulder right away. I don't think she was being kind at all. I don't think it went down the way Candy said it did. I think Betty knew when she got there that you need to get this swimsuit and get out of my house.
Yeah.
Stay away from my husband. I also don't believe this dissociative reaction line either. How many times as a parent do we shush a child or shush a baby?
Many.
So many times. You're like, shh, go back to sleep. Or, in a kind way, not in a mean way. Or hopefully to give my children any kind of future reaction like that. But her mom wouldn't have thought that either. She was just, shh, what are the neighbors going to think? Shh, what's the people in the hospital going to think? 41 strikes seems more of a panicked fight or flight response. Betty's blocking both exits. It's her house. She's familiar with it. Candy chooses to fight. If that axe is 6 to 8 pounds, 41 strikes would have been exhausting at the very least. I think this is pure adrenaline fueled. Not premeditated, but I don't think it quite went down the way Candy said it did either.
While the jury was deliberating, the sheriff's office received death threats against Candy and Dawn. Before it could be determined if they should leave the courthouse, the jury reached a verdict. Candy was found not guilty.
And they only deliberated for 3 hours.
That doesn't seem long enough. After the verdict, Candy and Pat had a party at their house.
Get out of jail party.
Candy felt that the worst was behind her and she could go on with her life. But Candy soon found out there was no normal for her in Texas. She received hate mail, people dressed up as Candy for Halloween, and sent poems to Dawn's office. One poem read, Candy Montgomery was a whore. She screwed around with Allan Gore. When Betty Gore brought it up, Candy used an axe to cut her up.
I think this is a really clever rhyme. It's dark.
Yeah.
Should not have been sent.
Yeah.
But it was really clever.
Yes.
The hate mail was apparently so bad that Pat had to open all of the mail, and she was looked at around the community as like a scarlet woman. No one at church would be friends with her anymore. Even if the murder was self-defense, she had still sinned by having an affair. That poem, though, reminded me of Lizzie Borden. Did you get that vibe?
I got that vibe.
So the Lizzie Borden rhyme goes, Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her father 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her mother 41. And this is 41 whacks with the axe. I was like, dang.
Yeah.
It's a very specific number for both women.
By November 5th, 1980, just 8 days after the verdict, the Montgomerys decided to leave Dallas. So which one do we like better?
Candy or Love and Death?
Yes.
So Candy is a 2022 Hulu original, and Love and Death was released on Max in 2023. I've watched Love and Death twice now, and then I've watched Candy once, and I really thought they can't beat Love and Death. Like, it's really good. And then you start watching Candy, and it is a different perspective, and I think Candy's a little bit more factual, so I liked that maybe better in the end. Candy did change the name of the kids, which I think had a great idea at heart, maybe to protect their privacy, but then Love and Death follows a year later, and they're using the kids' real names. Hulu is also much more open about the time that Bethany is alone in her crib, and it's just really hard to watch.
Oh, yeah.
It was a little bit more artistic, maybe. You know, you had like Allan standing in the utility room and the red light coming through, and they foreshadow it a little bit with the axe hanging in the garage, and you're like, oh snap, that's the axe, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of red lighting.
Mm-hmm. The acting in Candy, though, much more stiff. Like, it's not as well rehearsed, maybe, as Love and Death. Jessica Biel definitely looked more like Candy in the beginning with the short permed hair.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Olsen doesn't really look like her until later with the trial. I don't know, she's so gorgeous, like you don't want her to have that permed hair.
Yeah.
I also found it interesting that Elizabeth Moss was supposed to play Candy, but was replaced by Jessica Biel due to scheduling conflict.
I did not know that. She would have been really good.
She would have been really good. When I was watching Love and Death, I was looking at those realtor photos of 410 Dogwood, and they did a fantastic job on the set. So Candy is looking at Betty, and there's a bookshelf behind her, and in the realtor photos, the bookshelf is still there today. It was eerie. I literally turned the computer around. My husband was like, look at that! Like, as we were watching this scene inside the Gore house, and it looked just like it still looks today.
Yeah, because there wasn't a bookshelf in Candy, was there, that you saw?
I don't remember seeing it in Candy.
Mm-mm. Love
and Death also had her, like, stirring or making cake in a Corelle bowl that I have upstairs. And so just, there's a lot of overlap there, real life. Like, they used good props. Like, it really was time-stamped appropriately. What did you think?
You know, we've got Jessica Biel and Elizabeth Olsen both playing Candy. They're both phenomenal. I watched Love and Death first with Elizabeth Olsen. And by the way, when I was watching it, I didn't realize it was based on a true story.
It has a disclaimer at the end, doesn't it? Or no, that's Candy.
Yeah.
Love and Death doesn't say that it's a true story. Oh, well.
Maybe it did. I'm not sure. 100%. But like I was going into it
unaware.
As like, yeah, like I did not know it was a true story.
At the end of every Candy episode, they tell you.
Yes, I know Candy for sure.
But Love and Death doesn't do that. So that is interesting.
I thought she was like, she played it magnificent. She played the part very well. No competition there in my mind. However, I did think Jessica really surprised me in the Candy Hulu series.
Me too, yeah.
I agree that the acting was more stiff. Definitely. But I liked that touch to it because it brought like a more artistic feel.
It did.
Like what you said. I found this funny. Justin Timberlake, who was Jessica Biel's husband, just appeared in Candy.
And he has
that made me giggle.
I know, and he has a bigger part than I thought he was going to have.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, it's Justin Timberlake. I thought he was just going to be like somebody walking in the background. No, he has a part.
No, he was a full-on cop.
He was, and he did really good.
Yeah.
Good for him.
Did you notice also the other cop was Jason Ritter, who is Melanie, the girl that plays Betty, Melanie's husband?
I don't know who Jason Ritter is.
Jason Ritter? What?
What else does he do?
Well, he was in the other cop. Well, his father was an actor. I can't think of his name. Something Ritter.
The one that died young?
Yes, he had a heart attack like on set.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
But no, so the husbands and the wives were playing together in Candy. I thought that was
good for them.
I thought that was funny. I was not expecting that whatsoever. It was cool to see. But ultimately for me, Candy on Hulu wins for the production and the art of the filmmaking, and then the Love and Death with Elizabeth Olsen wins the acting.
So overall, did you like Candy more? It's hard, right?
It's so hard because Elizabeth Olsen is there for me.
I know. She does a phenomenal job.
Yeah. Like, I'm a big MCU fan. So, like, especially Scarlet Witch is what she plays, she is absolutely amazing. So I feel like I would choose Love and Death, but I really do appreciate Candy as well.
Different perspectives. They were both really good.
Yeah.
Betty Gore is buried at Upchurch Cemetery in Norwich, Kansas. Candy and Pat are both still alive today and possibly living in Georgia. Shortly after the trial, Pat and Candy moved to Georgia, where Candy's parents lived. According to Texas Monthly, Candy and Pat divorced just 4 years later. Pat stuck with Candy through so much: 2 affairs, a murder trial, potentially losing his job, relocating, what he had to handle with the kids. Mm-hmm. So that would have been so hard on them. We also don't hear anything about Candy's parents. Were they supportive at the trial? I feel like he had this really good gig at Texas Instruments, and there was not a Texas Instruments Georgia, and they picked up and moved really soon after the trial.
8 days.
Yeah. Candy obtained a therapist license under her maiden name, Candace Wheeler, in 1996. The therapist's license expired in 2012, but Candy, in 2012, she would have been 63 years old, so she could have just retired. For a short time, Candy and her daughter Jenny worked together as therapists. Candy is 75 years old today.
Within 2 months of Betty's death, Allan was openly seeing Elaine Clift. They would be married 3 months later, either late 1981 or early 1981. Allan and Elaine relocated, and Allan loses custody of his daughters after 4 years. In 1988, Elisa and Bethany were formally adopted by Betty's parents. Elisa was 7 years old and Bethany 11 months old at the time of the murder.
And as if these kids had not gone through enough, Elisa and Bethany would later say that Allan and Elaine would punish them by withholding food or making them take cold showers. Elisa also said that Elaine made her read Evidence of Love when she was just 10 years old.
That's psychotic.
It really is. I read that book in its entirety, and there is no reason that a 10-year-old kid should be reading it.
No.
Let alone that 10-year-old kid. Betty's father would remember a time when Bethany returned from a visit with Allan and Elaine with chunks of her hair missing from her scalp. To this day, both girls appear to be estranged from Allan Gore.
Candy's attorney, Don Crowder, died by suicide on November 10th, 1998. He had purchased a gun in the weeks prior, and his wife, Sherry, found him in the workout room that morning. Don told Sherry he would shoot himself if she touched the door. She kept him talking for a half hour, and Don told her to get dressed. Don took his life, and the bullet struck the wood just 2 inches above Sherry's head.
This really shook me up. I was Team Pat and Team Don through and through.
Mm-hmm.
And then I stumbled upon this article talking about his suicide. And he tells her, hey, go get dressed. I won't do anything when you're gone. She comes back downstairs. They pray together. She's telling him, let me call your kids. Let me call your dad. We'll get you some help. And he shoots himself. And that bullet coming 2 inches above her head. He had recently closed a restaurant, and he had been arrested for a DUI. And based on this article I read, it seemed like he was kind of always chasing that high. Like he was a sports star. He was winning the underdog case. He was owning a restaurant without experience. But as he got older, he just didn't want to slow down. His first wife would say that some people helped horses and they helped kids. So many kids stayed with them from Don's cases through the years. So just this one tore me up so bad.
Yeah.
A Reddit poll from 2022 definitely shows reasonable doubt. The question was, did Candy Montgomery get away with murder? 259 responses to yes, Betty deserves justice, and 204 responses to no, Candy acted in self-defense. This blew me away. That is why the jury only deliberated for 3 hours. There is so much reasonable doubt here.
I mean, that just goes to say the jury was not really crazy as people thought.
Yeah, they were unsure if it was self-defense or was straight-up murder. We talked about our theories. So if we have any listeners that want to send us an email, send us a message, we list all of our socials here, reach out. We want to hear what your opinions are.
Yes.
Are you with the, yes, Betty deserves justice, or are you team, no, Candy acted in self-defense? We're going to end here on a weird fact. Bertha Pomeroy, Betty's mother, went to a palm reader when she was 13 years old. The palm reader told her that Bertha would marry a farmer from out of state. They would have 3 children, but one of them would die. Bob and Bertha were both born in Kansas, but they met in Oklahoma, and obviously one of their kids did die.
That is pretty eerie.
Spooky.
Our sources for this episode will be listed in our episode notes. You can reach us at corruptpod@gmail.com, corrupt.podcast on Instagram, corruptpod on YouTube, and corruptpodcast on Facebook. Don't forget to subscribe to catch our next episodes. Please also leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Bye.
Bye.